So Jackie, Ruth is one of the two books in the Bible that's named for a woman, along with Esther. But even more than Esther is an incredibly woman-centric narrative, like almost radically given the broader context of the Hebrew Bible. What do we make of that? I mean, aside from the fact that its rarity tells us something about the society it came out of.
I mean, if I may begin with a joke, it is really, a classic Jewish mother-in-law sort of story, where the mother-in-law is in charge. And I'm saying that in jest, but there's something really interesting about how the story begins with all of the men perishing. And so we don't even have at the very beginning of the story any kind of like male thinking subject. All of the male characters throughout the story are, yes, they have dialogue, but they are so peripheral to the actual plot and to the work that's happening in the story. They're necessary to make things happen, and that's obviously sort of a reflection of ancient Israelite society. But it is remarkable that being the sort of social background of the text, this is a work that is really radically centered on female characters and their relationship to one another, which makes it very different from Esther.
Right. It's not that it passes the Bechdel test.
No.
Because most of what they talk about is, I mean, a lot of it is like
saving the name of men.
Husbands, former or future.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, how often in the Bible can you think of any place where two women are speaking to each other?
And yet, I don't think that there's something sort of particularly motherly or feminine in a sense of like difference between these two characters. I think that their relationship to each other is really mapped onto patriarchal norms. And I think that the way that Naomi issues instruction and command to Ruth once Ruth becomes part of her household is really on the model of a father and a son.
But is that actually perhaps a reflection of like legitimately how ancient Israelite society worked, which is to say widows, right, essentially became heads of household. I mean, they're vulnerable in the sense that they don't have like the male social protection, but at the same time, if they're of a certain age, and Naomi seems to be, they're not returning to their father's household, right? They have a sort of independence, and how does that manifest except as on the model of, I mean, you said, right, their house, right? The house of the father becomes the house of the mother.
Right. I mean, in this story, it radically does in explicit terms, right? So if you were to compare this story to Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38, Tamar is said to go back to the house of her father.
Right.
But in Ruth, both Ruth and Orpah, and we can mention in a second the way the names of characters figure into the story in a really enmeshed and dynamic way. Naomi tells both Ruth and Orpah to return to the house of their mother. So there's.
So you think it's consciously, it's not reflective of actual ancient society. It's consciously playing against it.
Yes, I think that it's trying to pose questions and make moves. To what end? Up for discussion. But there are some fascinating things that happen in situating Naomi and Ruth as relating to each other in the absence of men, and also in a time it's in the absence of men and at the point of peril of the family, right? She says, "There are no more sons in me that I can give to you." maybe we're getting like a peek behind the curtain into sort of notions, ancient Israelite concepts of anatomy and physiology here. She does not have any more sons within her that she can bear so that Ruth can do what Tamar was trying to do. And so there's going to have to be some other mechanism. But yes, I mean, and so in a sense, with Naomi kind of barren, right, without a kind of, we could talk about like, queer futures, right? Naomi's forced to do something different. And that's how the story is structured.
So at the same time that it's, as we just described, subverting some or sort of playing with some of the patriarchal norms, it's also very much a story about women living in a society in which they are vulnerable.
And harassed.
Right?
I mean, to such an extent, right, that, both Naomi and, this character Boaz who shows up out of nowhere, right?
He's the Boaz ex machina.
I mean, who even knows how he's related? Right. No one actually knows how he's related in the story, but we're just told he's a relative, he can do the job, right? I mean, yes, there was actually, in fact, someone who is an even closer relative who could do the job of taking on Ruth to attach to the family line in order to produce an heir so that that line can continue. But this other guy said, no thanks. I mean, he said yes initially when there was a prospect of getting land, right? It's like, oh, I can get some land. Oh, yeah, sure, I'll do it.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, but there's a wife involved. Oh, you know what? Actually, I think I'll take a pass. I'm not going to diminish my estate through more heirs than what I have, right? So that's sort of the underlying assumed logic that the author is assuming knowledge for the audience that they know this.
Is Boaz there's obviously a contrast between Boaz and unnamed guy who
Ploni Almoni,
right,
yeah.
guy who doesn't do his job.
Mr. So-and-so, right?
Is the contrast, in fact, that does it have to do with care about land versus actual care for the human being of Ruth? Like, Boaz seems to actually care about her as a person.
Does he?
I don't know, you tell me. Does he not?
I mean, I wonder if we're projecting into the story by saying, Boaz cares about Ruth as a person. Boaz seems to hold a value for the continuation of the family name and to make the kind of economic sacrifices that are necessary to do that, whereas someone else who is closer, who shall no longer be named, is not willing to make that sacrifice. So, if you think about all of, Boaz actually speaks about Ruth's kindness towards him, and not really the reverse, right? What's going on the threshing floor scene? What actually is the kindness?
Okay, I think you and I both know what we think it is, but honestly, I think that for a lot of readers, that's shocking, right?
And yet the tone of the story is so innocent. It really takes up a very sincere and innocent tone. And so it may be jarring. Some may suggest that if we were to say we know what's happening on the threshing floor, that we're overreading. What Boaz says is, you were kind to go with me because you could have gone with someone much younger. Interpret that as you'd like. It is interesting that Ruth only has kind of like the veneer of agency here. She may be held up in readings of the story as, woman hear me roar, a woman with great agency. But in fact, what are her choices, right? Her choice is to actually return to her family home or to stay with Naomi. This is a kind of example that the text gives of her chesed, her devotion, right? She is devoted, which means she's willing to do things without the expectation that she's supposed to do them. So she's acting as if she has to, but she doesn't. And so she does, this is her kindness towards Naomi, right? She doesn't have to protect Naomi's land and family line, but she does it anyways. And then she does the same with Boaz. And so Ruth is this, comes out as this great hero, but only in saving the patriarchy.
Right. So the shape of the book is so interesting. As you said, it starts with all of the male figures being eliminated, and then it's a story about these women. And then over the course of the book, right, how does the book end? The book begins with male death. It ends with the birth of lineage. It is really, in a sense, you can read it as a book about, I think you've suggested, how women and women's bodies maybe are instrumentalized to preserve, patriarchy is maybe too big here, but like lineage and inheritance and land, and those are all part of the sort of complex of patriarchal ideas.
And yet it's not that simple, because in the end, it's not Boaz's child, right?
That's right. Nobody thinks of David as the descendant of Boaz.
Right, and all the more so, right? The women speak in the end, right, to attest to this great thing that has happened, that a child has been born to, not Ruth, not Boaz, not even Elimelech, to Naomi. What do we make of that?
Should this book be called the Book of Naomi?
One wonders. And that's probably why we need to also look at this genealogy that comes at the end, rendering Ruth David's ancestress. Mm-hmm. What does that do? Ruth is a foreigner. She is a Moabitess. And it's a story of return. And the language looks late. It's not a book that we would presume to be composed in the time of the judges, whatever that may mean, but rather a story, perhaps a Romana clef, about a different kind of return and a different set of anxieties that are being worked through of foreign wives and the descendants of families claiming inherited offices. So some of those things I think are also being worked out in that story.
Yeah. In the end, this is a book that you and I will situate in one particular place chronologically. That is a story about an earlier time that has become sort of this this central text for all kinds of different reasons for later readers. There's really nothing like Ruth, I think, in the biblical canon. It's a little jewel, and it's so, as we've discussed in only our brief time here, so many facets to the thing.